Hello everybody, this is Allicia Garsía-Herrero. I'm Chief Economist for Asia Pacific at Natixis, which is a French investment bank operating throughout Asia. And I hope you like this presentation on a very topical issue, which is how we're moving from trade wars to literally currency wars. Are we there now? And this is what I'm going to devote about 30 minutes of your time today listening to this presentation. Thank you for your patience. Please do contact me. You have my email in that presentation. If you were to have questions, comments, they're most welcome. So here you go. From a trade to a pandemic to a dollar war. And I use the word dollar because it's kind of very obviously not just a currency war, meaning everybody against everybody. It's really everybody against the dollar. And this is the specific part of that type of currency war that I would talk to as we move along. But before I go to the end of the story, please bear with me and let me show you what I'm going to cover in these few minutes. The first is, where are we? Of course, where are we with the pandemic and some immediate impact of where we are in 2021. The next is really about the macroeconomic consequences, medium-term macroeconomic consequences of the pandemic. And then zooming into those consequences, I will talk about the dollar reserve currency role and how that relates to the pandemic and its consequences, and then some takeaways. So on the first point, where are we? And this should be an easy question and perhaps a relatively easy answer because we have so many people looking into it globally. And we have really done, at least maybe not we economy, but certainly virologists and other scientists, great strides in finding vaccines that should, and this is the should, basically bring this pandemic to an end in 2021. And when I say 2021, it's because really when we started talking about the vaccines in December, you know, with firm evidence of their reliability, everybody thought the pandemic would come to an end in general terms in 2021. I would argue that even first half of 2021, the idea is that we would have herd immunity in large economies in the developed world, and that would already in itself basically bring us back to where we were before the pandemic. And I think, frankly, it's fair to say that was too optimistic. So first, the optimism remains in some areas. So we have quite a rapid acceleration of growth in the US expected. Our call is rather modest compared to others. It is 4.2% growth in the US, coming from a relatively, of course, negative, but not as terrible as Europe recession in 2020. Now, the thing is, okay, that is based on the fact that the US population will achieve herd immunity by the summer. And again, is that feasible? The US might be, frankly speaking, perhaps easier than, I would argue, Asia or Europe. And I'll come back to that point in a minute. But what I think is unavoidable is that the income distribution will continue to worsen. And this, of course, obviously includes the US, if you ask me, even more than everywhere else or anywhere else, because of the massive increase in asset prices in the US, particularly equity prices, creating this K effect that we've long been discussed, and making richer, and of course still dragging along for those who still depend on a salary. We just had recent, labor day and employment data in the US is still not out of the woods. And I think in terms of disposable income and differences across income brackets, we will continue to see further deterioration of income distribution. Of course, Biden is very aware. action is being taken, but that's going to be a different type of US, meaning a more interventionist US, a more state-centric US, and indeed to basically counteract part of that worsening of the income distribution. So I think this is important for the dollar, because we're going to see a massive stimulus, whether it's going to be 1.9 trillion or something closer to the Republican proposal, hard to know, but it's certainly going to be more stimulus, and I think it's going to be more prone towards the lower part of the income bracket. And in all, this is going to have consequences on the dollar, and perhaps depending on how the money is spent on productivity in the US and long-term growth in the US. So it is important to realize that every action that is now taken, especially by the US, will have an impact on the dollar, not only the value of the dollar, but its reserve currency status. So if I move on to the next point, which is Europe, Europe is really different story, much harder hit by the pandemic than the US, and also with another shock on its shoulders, which is Brexit. Europe is really coming very, very weak out of this crisis, out of this pandemic, and out of that weakness, and of course a lot of disappointment during the Trump era, the Trump administration, the EU is trying to find its place in the world, and that is through the concept of economic sovereignty. That economic sovereignty basically means that the EU needs to find space in the world between the two main powers, and this power competition, or great power competition we are into. The EU wants to not to be divided into either or just align with the US would be the most natural behavior, but rather find its space. And by doing that, of course, actions have been taken. The most obvious one is the signing of the EU-China Comprehensive Investment Agreement. So it is an important signal from Europe's side that Europe tries to remain on the same boat in this era, especially given the further weakness from the pandemic, and thus move slightly, of course not absolutely, towards the Chinese space through this deal. Of course, the deal has not yet been ratified, and a lot of things can happen. Just remember that it was signed right before Biden came to power, so on the 30th of December. Now the question is, can the EU put up with the pressure, if there is going to be pressure, but in my opinion, there will be pressure from the Biden administration to align, perhaps in exchange for some economic benefits. This is very related to the dollar, because the US still today, and still with Biden, has kept its tariffs on steel out of national security reasons on Europe. So the question is, will the US be more magnanimous, put it this word, with Europe, as in exchange for Europe to be more aligned? This is important for the dollar, because the bigger the block of alliances, the stronger the power, or at least the easier it will be for the US to keep that reserve currency status longer. So again, there's a lot of things to take into account to get into that question. The other thing is Asia. So Asia, I think the view right until mid-January, in my opinion, was the winners, the first in, first out, starting with China, but of course not only, there's many other successful Asian countries or economies, and South Korea, by the way, is one of them, and we have Vietnam, and we have Taiwan, and quite a few. But I think we need to realize that in some countries, Malaysia, Japan, we have had emergency situations, being in the case of Japan through prefectures, in Malaysia at the national level. So of course we're not fully out of the woods. In Thailand we had a fast increase in numbers, in cases, as you can see from that graph. And some, many Asian economies, to be frank, don't have a very high percentage of the population being fully secured in terms of vaccine orders. So you have the best case on point, which is Australia, followed by, less 230+% of the population covered by the vaccine orders. So, the procurement has worked well. Japan is half of that, followed by Hong Kong, India, Malaysia, then South Korea. So, you already go below 100 very, very soon, right after Japan. So you can tell that there's still a lot of procurement issues in Asia. Some people say, never mind, because the cases in a place like Taiwan or Vietnam, which is the lowest procurement ratio, are so small, but that has a big assumption that there are no new waves. So, and of course, let alone the mutations we're seeing. So, I just feel that we're being slightly naive when we talk about the time frame to really be in herd immunity and to be out of the woods. And that's important because the longer this lasts, the more disruptions there will be, and in a way, the more somehow the more the least easy it will be to actually figure out what's going to happen with the reserve currency role of the dollar, because we'll be in a disruptive mode. The longer we're in a disruptive mode, the harder it will be to predict, basically, that reserve currency role of the dollar. Not that it's going to change tomorrow, but the speed at which it will change might actually accelerate if disruptions out of COVID last longer. I think that's partially, of course, for domestic reasons too, but if you ask me, that's partially why the US is, in a way, accelerating massively the vaccination campaign, because that gives them, in a way, back to control. We're very far from that in Europe, and frankly, of course, the cases are low, but in terms of procurement, also in Asia, and that's important to realize. In fact, if I dwell deeper on this point, you will see that we are actually still on the without vaccine rollout plans in several economies, such as China, of course, Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam. So, there is a lot to know still as to when we will end with this process. On top of that, I think I'd like to talk a little bit more about medium term. And the medium term, I have to say, everything I have listed here is quite negative. So maybe I should start by the positive, which isn't even there. But I think isn't big enough to change my call. And my call is a world with, again, a square root recovery, meaning more income inequality. But I wouldn't stop there, because a K recovery can't really stop at a K recovery. I think K recovery means trouble down the road in terms of populism, disruption, social disruption. Why? Because the degree of income inequality is already very high in the world, higher than it has been, at least in the last few decades after the Second World War. So this is why, adding to that already pretty fragile income distribution, partially because of technology and innovation, will be indeed very disruptive. So I'm not denying the role of innovation, research, fast discovery. Look at what happened with vaccines. Surely very important. But I think the overwhelming effect here will be this massively worse income distribution. Why? First, stagnant investment, private investment. This is and even public investment, because the public sector will need to deal with the daily issues, to basically keep people employed, keep companies up, alive. So investment will of course be much weaker, and with that potential growth. And then, of course, the piling up of debt is obviously very negative for growth, potential growth. Then we have the obvious asset price bubbles, worsening income distribution, massive state intervention with a lot of zombie companies, loss of human capital, which is, of course, a problem, because even the loss of human capital is very dependent on your income, meaning on your means, as we all know. So, we've learned this the hard way with COVID, and I think that's only going to accelerate that worsening income distribution and the consequences thereafter, as I mentioned. And then finally, deglobalization, but also decoupling, bifurcation, as we call it now, or if you don't believe in deglobalization, at least globalization, will worsen income distribution, because it basically means that one of the key ways in which the emerging world was converging with the developed world through trade investment will be less of an opportunity, less available than before. So that's the world. I think we see that, although since 2020, trade between the US and China has come back, but it had decelerated quite massively since 2018, since the trade war started. Now the question is, will it remain after Biden's speech on his relations, or his idea of relations with China, basically based on extreme competition? I wonder whether this trend is going to continue. One would probably argue that trade and investment relations are going to suffer from that extreme competition. He actually fell short of saying conflict. In fact, he ruled out conflict and kept it to extreme competition. But extreme competition is not a call for reset, it's a call for bifurcation still now. So we're expecting more of that. This means FDI flows coming down, as you see in this presentation. And basically, the question then is, within this scenario, will we expect more dollar weakness? It has been the trend in 2020, but it can revert. And there's a number of reasons why it can revert. I think the main reason is we're already seeing it, is this reflation story, also the steepening of the curve. So U.S. Treasuries are, U.S. Treasury yields, long-term Treasury yields are moving up very aggressively. And of course, the shortest end of the curve is stuck with very, very lax monetary policies. So that steepening basically calls for inflows back into the U.S. and stronger dollar, and partially explained also by laxer fiscal policy, which needs to be, yes, there will be more supply of paper, but also projects to finance that capital globally may be happy to finance. At the end of the day, still the dollar is the reserve currency of the world, and the most traded currency of the world, and the most liquid currency of the world. So I do think that we're going to see maybe a reversal of that weak dollar call, and depending on how fast and how much long-term yields move up in the US. Now, this, however, is not necessarily fully related to the reserve currency role of the dollar, because there doesn't have to be a correlation between the value of the dollar and its reserve currency status. One thing that affects the reserve currency status more clearly is the weaponization of the dollar. So there you can see that there's a number of ways in which the dollar has been weaponized. I'm focusing now only on China. And as you know, this is just part of the story. So you have had a lot of export controls on the real economy side. You have also had the so-called entity list, but also the OFAC type list of military companies, which now has been delayed in terms of full implementation. But the reality is that this is very frightening for anybody holding dollar or or a dollar or a US investor. And I think it doesn't bode well for the dollar because of course, there could be substitution. But I think no matter how important, it is not in itself the end of the reserve currency role of the dollar, because at the end of the day, what you want to know if you hold dollars, yes, I'm using somebody's weaponizing this currency I'm holding, but I still need to have an alternative, not only for payments, which is what you could do to avoid these sanctions or transactions, but also as a pool of to keep my savings. So basically to preserve the value of my savings. And I think that is a very different topic. So there may be fewer transactions in dollars to avoid the sanctions. And we did a study that is Natix's research, Asia research, presented in this slide, where we look at whether financial institutions, U.S. financial institutions, were moving out of Chinese names. And in Hong Kong and other equity markets, we find that, yes, they did, but only for the sanctioned names, not for the rest. So there's a reshuffling. So in other words, they're not finding other names, they're just keeping, but just out of the sanctions. So the question is, would they move to other currencies? And I think for me, really, because of the liquidity issues, it's just not enough to have the sanctions for people to move out of the dollar. But more worrisome, though, is this decoupling, bifurcation, as some industry leaders have called for in the US. This very famous paper, Asymmetric Competition, which calls, this is the ex-CEO of Google, among many, calling for bifurcation, meaning in terms of tech, we just can't leave the floor as open as it is, because it will imply asymmetric competition and we may lose our edge. And that's much more important, because it will mean, and this brings me really to the key, that the dollar might only serve the purpose of the ecosystem under a certain technology, while the other, China and those in that sphere with a different technological approach, which in a way has been cut off the, let's call it, overarching approach, which would be the US-centric one, being cut off. They need to fully develop their own, and this is about self-reliance, etc. So if that happens, then the dollar will become the reserve currency of that ecosystem. It's a totally different world. That can happen tomorrow, but it's something to think about. I mean, how to, for Korea, the question is two strategies, two ecosystems, how to remain in the two. I don't know. I mean, that is a very important question. Now, on the dollar itself as reserve currency, many argue that balance sheet expansion by the Fed is just the reason for the dollar doom future. I don't agree with that, because everybody's expanding the balance sheet to a larger or lesser extent. Actually, BOJ even more than the Fed, or even the ECB more than the Fed, even to a large extent the PBOC. So, this is actually like a reflection of our times, yeah? And on the role of the dollar, if you just focus on payments, you can see that in other instances, 2011 to 12, and somehow up to mid 2013, the euro was more of not a reserve currency, because this is just about international payments. It's not about financial transactions overall, where the dollar fully dominates, yeah, issuance of offshore issuance, etc. But about payments really is very much about how your export capacity in the case of Europe basically is invoiced in euro, etc. So what I'm trying to say is that there is no clear correlation between this payment role of the dollar, or say the euro, and the value of the dollar versus the euro. And you look at the renminbi, there is flat and very, very low. So there's a long way to go. And I think we just can't think of the dollar demise tomorrow, which many call for. I think this is something that is overrated and exaggerated. I will move on because I know that we're running out of time. One thing that is very important for Korea is another form of weaponization of the dollar, which is the currency manipulation. There's a number of countries that have been labeled currency manipulators by the Treasury, actually by the previous administration right before they ended their mandate, which is Vietnam and Switzerland. But frankly, I don't think Biden is going to push this currency manipulation story, no matter his America First big start, because it is very, it's not multilateral. I think Biden is going to try to multilateralize a number of threatening tools and much more focused on China than a big chunk of candidates. So this thing, I think, is not as important as it would have been under Trump administration. Then if we talk about China retaliation, I think one more important issue is, can China really retaliate? People talk about US treasuries. I frankly think this is not feasible because of the massive liquidity in that market and the very many that can take the role of China. In fact, China has been decreasing its holdings of US treasuries. Europeans have been increasing their holdings. Others have been increasing their holdings. So I just don't think that it's easy for China to retaliate. And any type of retaliation sanction-wise is hardly credible because there's no currency behind that is international. The only obvious retaliation is this strategic retaliation, basically no access to the Chinese market. And that is a strong retaliation, but it's not based on sanctions or holdings of US treasuries. Beyond retaliation, whether strategic or not, I think the one important question for the future of the dollar is innovation, and in particular, the role of China's digital currency. And as you know, we are already well ahead in terms of trials and in Shenzhen and beyond. But of course, what we need to talk about is not so much the circulation of e-renminbi, let's call it that way, within China, but rather its cross-border circulation. And there we are full speed. Not only do we have a kind of a laboratory of this cross-border role by HKMA and the Bank of Thailand, which both, of course, have a high potentially high renminbi in circulation because of either tourists in the case of Thailand or simply being an offshore center like Hong Kong. But I think beyond, China just signed with SWIFT a JV, a joint venture, to help basically generalize the overseas circulation of the e-renminbi. So this is very important for the dollar because for payments, and let's remember, for payments, the renminbi can catch up much faster with the, I don't know how fast, but faster, I would put it this way, with the e-currency, which is widely accepted. The question is, will it be widely accepted? At what cost? And again, the stability of the currency. And I think for financial purposes, it is totally different because of the lack of capital account convertibility in China. Whether it's e-renminbi or not doesn't make a difference. So I will end with some takeaways. I hope maybe I've talked too long and it's been confusing. I hope I clarify a few issues in these final points. So first, 2019, and today. So 19 was really the trade war year. 2020 was the pandemic year. 2022 could be somehow global recovery, not fully. I tried to explain that I think we are possibly going to delay that massively fast global recovery for the reasons mentioned, delays with rollout of vaccine, etc. But certainly a recovery, but then it won't be only a nice recovery because we are having, of course, vaccine competition. We are having this idea of an embryonic currency war centered on the dollar. And then we're having other domestic problems, from income distribution, especially in the US, And for China, a big problem, which is globalization, for a country that has benefited so much from globalization, but even South Korea, I mean, it's of course a massive exporter. What's the world going to look like if those trade and investment flows slow down? Very important. On the dollar weakness, let's not confuse dollar weakness with the demise of the dollar as a reserve currency. I think that's much further away. Of course, the US has taken action that has harmed the reserve currency status of the dollar, such as the sanctions and other forms of weaponization. But and by the way, an innovation from China, of course, the e-renminbi may accelerate that. But, and that's my but, if we move into a bifurcated world, two ecosystems, at least in one of those ecosystems, the dollar is going to be king. So the idea of a currency that used to be king, so you know, the British pound before and so on, and suddenly passes the baton to a second currency, which becomes the global currency. I think that's maybe much more unlikely than we think. And it might well be that we have like two ecosystems with two currencies on the basis of the push for bifurcation that I see, especially in the US, but somehow well beyond Trump. And I would end here and thank you very much for your time.